Welcome, everybody. My name is Brian Mulligan. I'm from the Institute of Technology in Sligo in the west of Ireland. I suppose coming from the inside, I've been in higher education for 37 years and I'm an engineer. So I always thought that it was the job of an engineer to make what we do more efficient. And it came as a surprise to me when I got into education to find I was working with people who weren't trying to make the process more efficient. And that's for the last 37 years. And I sort of feel it's still there now. There are lots of reasons to bring down the cost of education. We hear stories from America about student debt, that the cost of provision of education just goes up more than inflation, and it's costing families and people a lot of money. In Europe, you don't hear that story so much, but it's not that it's that much cheaper to provide it, it's that the state is subsidizing it to a much larger degree. In the future, there are demographic changes, there are demands on healthcare, there are lots of other demands on state funds other than higher education. We're not the most important people. Even in Europe, I think it is our responsibility to reduce the cost of provision. You couldn't switch to the PowerPoint slide? In working in EdTech for the last, I suppose, 25 years, I've found that these are the three areas where people want to make an impact in quality, cost, and access. Now, myself, I've been working in distance learning for the last 20 years, so I've been working on access. But I also see cost, as I said, as an important issue. And I think it's an underemphasized issue. I think a lot of people are interested in quality, and that's a good thing. A lot of people are working on access, but I don't think enough people are working on the challenge of reducing the cost of provision. And so I propose that we have this debate so that we can think about, and to some extent crowdsource, your ideas on what we can do to reduce the cost of provision. Is an emphasis on reducing the costs going to damage the quality? So it might be that it is your opinion that we shouldn't be trying to reduce costs. That's a valid point of view as well. So that's what I want to discuss today. I've put a little Padlet together. There's a link there if you want to go to it. It's empty. And what I hope to do is, as we discuss this, maybe I'll add some sort of barriers. What are the things that are stopping us from reducing cost? And you can vote on those as well. So we do a little bit of crowdsourcing, if you don't mind. So that's the link there, and in a little while we'll switch over to the Padlet and see if there's any activity on it. Okay, I'm going to we were due to have several speakers, but with the upsurge in COVID, some of the speakers had to cancel. Ulrike, I wanted her in from the start, and Ulf has volunteered to come in and contribute as well. So it's a bit smaller than we'd originally planned. But possibly, and the audience is a bit smaller as well, but possibly maybe more intimate and better for discussion. So if you want to come in closer, by the way, feel free to do that. But, you know, actually it would be quite nice, as close as you feel safe. So now, rather than me read out biographies, I'm going to ask my two panel members, and I'm going to be in this. I'm not just going to be a chair. I have very strong opinions. I'll be in here in this discussion as well, and I give you some of my opinions already. So I'm going to just ask them to briefly to introduce themselves and maybe what their background is, and for them to give their opinions on the challenge of cost reduction. Okay, Ulrike?
Hello, everybody. My name is Ulrike Wild. I will first tell what I do and where I work, and probably switch to some statements as well later. I am working at Wageningen University in the Netherlands, so I come from the Netherlands, from the Dutch system. My university is a small but very high-profile university in the area of life sciences. Let's say how to feed 17 billion people and keep the planet safe and healthy would be our main topics all around. I am a program director. I have led a program for online degrees. We have several master degrees fully online, and I led a program as well for open and online education, so scalable education in terms of, let's say, MOOCs. Then everybody knows we are a member of edX, and we as well we took the MOOCs as well as part of our education. Now I am as well a leader of a national program on flexibilization. Let's say one of the goals is opening up for lifelong learning, and as well adapting the systemic administration infrastructure more for student mobility across all institutions who are there, which could be a part of getting more efficient as well. For your information, the Netherlands, we have a public funding up to the master degree. There is a small part of tuition fee for the students, but basically it's funded. And the universities, once the student has graduated, they receive the fund for this graduation part, so for the bachelor or the master, which means there is as well a slight pressure on being efficient in educating these students in 3, 4, or 5 years. The student, of course, the tuition fee is quite low for the students, and there is a division between students from the European Economic Region. For them, they all have access to our system. If you are international students from Asia or the United States, you would pay the full tuition fee, so the full institutional tuition fee. Housing, of course, is not included, but the students currently can loan from the state on quite good conditions, but it's very heavily discussed because it used to be a study grant, so they want to go back for a study grant as well, that the students really have time for their student life. What you already can hear, it's a high societal value and belief or in the culture that a student should have the right actually and the accessibility and the affordability for this wonderful period in life to be a bachelor, to become part of the academic society, to get educated in all these kind of aspects. And it is really not at all a discussion to make it more for cost reduction. On the contrary, I think what the institutions got didn't went up during the last decades, but the number of students actually did rise sky high. So there is rather the question, could we have more funding to be able to efficiently educate students? And of course, if you look at it, for me, working in online education for quite a long time, there is one lesson I learned, and very often I was asked, can it become cheaper? Can it be more efficient? And of course it can. But there is always this first, you have to invest quite heavily to have all the materials, the courses, the whatever you need in place and before you can share and make it really scalable and reusable and accessible. I would add, I am a strong believer in making education more efficient, because I think, of course, we should use all the scalable methods and all this kind of thing to really use it wisely and to have scalable and online methods at place, so that we can use actually more expensive education, like lab work, developing, all these kind of things in the thing that we really can provide it in a small scale and expensive way as well. And as well, I think I am very happy that we live in a society where education is highly valued and should be accessible. And so for me, it's more the question, it's a political question, how long this will actually stay the same. But I certainly wouldn't be before the politicians come in and say it should be cheaper. And yeah, and so I think let's talk about efficiency, and let's talk about effectiveness, and let's talk how we can cater more flexible learning paths and more different ways of educate people, and more lifelong learning as well, and making that, growing that a lot, but not immediately switch to cost reduction, because that in the end is a question we all have to ask ourselves. And we want, last but not least thing, as we want to be a knowledge-based economy, we really need to provide the people who can have this knowledge base. So otherwise, there is no knowledge-based economy. And I speak on my own terms, by the way. I'm not from the government and not from my institution, so consider everything I say as my private opinion.
Thank you, Ulrike. I think we'll get Ulf to make his contribution now, and then we'll open it to the floor. And I have a whole list of questions as well. So go ahead.
Yeah, thank you very much, Ulrike, also for this talk. And I resonated with a lot of things you were saying, because I feel that when we talk about cost, we, like Brian has actually said here, we have to understand that cost of higher education is not a standalone issue. It is connected to these other dimensions, quality and access. And I think we have to look a little bit behind that. What is actually quality and what is access? What is standing behind that? What's the impact of access? The impact of access, I like to say, is social cohesion. Social cohesion and societies which can prosper and have mutual understanding of differences. So that's the impact of having a good access to education in general and to higher education in particular. Quality is connected to the question of empowering people to shape the future. It's connected to questions of skills. It's connected to questions of innovation, the innovation power of societies, you can say. So if you talk about costs, you always have to understand that you are in a room in which you want to position yourself either on one pole or on the other pole or on the third pole. And in the last years, it was always when we talked about digitalization and the promise of digital technology for education, it was always the big question there, can we somehow change this relation? Can we somehow break this iron triangle, which Sir John Daniel always talks about, this iron triangle, when he says, no, you cannot break it actually. If you want to change quality, you have to bring up costs or reduce excess and so on and so on. So if you want to change this triangle, we have to understand that we have to find quite smart solutions for that. Yeah, and the question I would like to put here on the table, if we would have one, is digital technology enabling this kind of pathway to change this triangle or not? So. Second point I want to make is I'm a professor of education. I'm an educationalist by passion also. Yeah, I'm an activist for education, and education has to do for me, and that's what I wanted to say before. So also, if you talk about costs, you have to understand also, I think, that you're always talking about education from a certain perspective. Yeah. There was a study commissioned by the European Commission in the beginning of this century, around 2002 or something, and the question was, how do European countries finance their education? That was the big question. And there was a delegation from some countries, and they went around and they tried to talk to people, talk to policymakers, talk to cultural organizations, education organizations, and so on, and try to find out how do they finance this? What is their view on financing, on the costs of education here? And they found interesting things. They found, if you would summarize it under the line at the end of the day, they would probably summarize it in a way to say, in the Scandinavian countries, and maybe also in the Netherlands, there is a culture of understanding education in a way that it is contributing to prospering societies, and students are viewed as citizens. And so the responsibility for financing this is, so to speak, attributed to society. Yeah. So, and in the southern European countries, students are viewed as family members. Yeah, that's, well, probably it's a very schematic way of putting this, but the so to speak, the costs of higher education, lifelong learning also, is quite a lot attributed to the family. So, then in the Anglo-Saxon countries, also north of France, I thought so far also not the Netherlands, but I was now corrected in my understanding there. You can see that education is seen as an individual investment in your individual career, and so the costs for education, for higher education, are attributed to the individual in a way. And that's quite interesting, and now I come back to the point I actually wanted to make as point number 2. That's it, that the discussion on cost is also a discussion of your understanding of education in the end of the day. And if you are, so to speak, going down the route that education is contributing to a society which has a certain degree of cohesion, which takes care of each other, which is proactively integrating different opinions, which tries to bring forth innovation for all, not just for the rich, but for all, to bring the society, so to speak, in front for all. Then the cost of education is something which has to do with the society at large. And it is not a cost, it is an investment. Well, okay, costs are also, investments are also cost, but you start to view costs as investment into the future alliance of generations, you can say, so to speak, in societies. There is a wonderful sociologist, world-famous Niklas Luhmann. Whoever has to do with sociology knows this name. He was the inventor of the systems theory, and he's always saying, or he said, he's dead now, but he said, I was studying at University of Bielefeld when he was still there, and he was always saying, pedagogy as a system, education as a system, pedagogy as a system, not as a science, but pedagogy as a system, like politics or economy, pedagogy, the education system, has a technology deficit, he said. And this technology deficit expresses itself in the deficit of not being able to optimize the system in the same way you would understand to optimize the efficiency of a production process. You can, of course, optimize logistics. That's not a question, yeah? You can make the buildings cheaper, and you can, I don't know, but so to speak, what is inside the quality of the education process cannot be optimized like a production system because it has a technology deficit. Well, it's probably a long discussion to to go into that, but that's my second point. If you understand education in a certain way, the question of do we want to reduce costs is depending on your understanding. But then on the other hand, I want also to so to speak, give a point to this discussion, because when I was in the US, and I don't want to blame the US for it, but when I was in the US, which I now present as one example of a system in which education costs, higher education costs something. The last time, it was 4 or 5 years ago in a congress in Washington, and I met a senator, and he said, you know, what the problem here is in our biographies, when we go to a fairly decent university, maybe even Ivy League university, we are paying for this education if we want to become a doctor, a medical doctor, for example. And it's costing in an Ivy League more or less $450,000. So, and that's not a problem, because usually we also earn a lot if we have a good education. So that's embedded in the system. But then we meet our wife there. He said, he was a guy, so he said, we meet our wife, probably women would meet their husband or whatever, their partner in life. He said, from my perspective, my wife was in the same position. So when we married then in the end, and we bought a house, at the beginning of our lives, of our careers, we had a debt of $1 million US dollars. Super educated, but super poor also. And he said, the thing is, it was not a problem from the economy side of things. We were not worried, yeah, that we are bankrupt, because we are both highly educated, we have good jobs, and over time we get the money, you know. But the problem is that we didn't feel free to just say, we are changing our jobs. We didn't feel free to go to our employers and say, you know what, we really have to talk. What you do here is not how a company has to be run, you know. We didn't feel free in that sense, because there was always this thing that we need somehow to have a constant, steady income flow to assure that this 1 million of debts is going to be reduced. So that's on the other hand, yeah. In Germany, where I am from, higher education is free. And the last point I wanted to make is that it is a very relevant question, because we have these systems where higher education is not free. And these are not worse or better systems. These are just systems which organize it in a different way. And the last time there's one very, very beautiful university project. Now it's I think almost out of the project zone. It's in Seattle. It's called Minerva University, Minerva project. It's so beautiful because it's really trying to support future skill development with the graduates. The students are studying 7 semesters, and each semester in a different country across the entire world. And still the university owners, it's of course a paid university education, they try to keep the costs down. And the European representatives, because he knew that I was very interested in research on future skills, called me once, and he said, can we not somehow make a partnership, you know, between Minerva in the US and now bring it to Europe, you know? And I told him, no, I don't see a point there, because in Germany we have a free education, a higher education system, and you are very expensive. And he said, what? I said, yeah, you are very expensive. He said, we are not expensive. If you consider US tuition fees, we are actually making elite higher education very, very cheap, available for 28,000 euros a year only. And that's what you pay in the UK right now, more or less, if you add housing and stuff to the tuition fees. So that was an interesting discussion, because I sat there and I thought, wow, he's right. From his perspective, he's right. From my perspective, I'm also right. So I think that's what shows how relevant it is to talk about this issue of costs connected to quality, to the underlying understanding of education, and also to see in this example, that was my fourth point today in the beginning now, in the last one, that higher education is not just viewed in this world as let's say, a societal, from the angle of a societal necessity, but also, of course, as a commodity, which is traded offshore and so on. So Australia, for example, is the big exporter of, or exporting nation of a higher education, for example, to African countries. So the question is always, is that good or not good? I don't know. Well, I have an opinion on that, but that's, I think, the point of our discussion. Yeah. Thank you.
Can I ask, is there a theme emerging here where you're saying that, sure, let's find efficiencies in higher education, but let's use the savings for other things that we should be doing in higher education, that you're not really, you wouldn't necessarily, I think I got this from you, Ulrike, that you mightn't be suggesting that we reduce the percentage of our national GDP that we spend on education. This is a social thing. We should decide to spend so much money on education and spend it as wisely as possible. Is this the theme that's emerging?
Yes, for me it is. Yes. Of course, this is a political discussion, how much of your GDP do you spend on education. Yeah. But you should spend, as a society, money on education to make it accessible, affordable, and as good as possible. That's the bottom line. And I like the idea what many of your ideas, that, and in the end, that I think we cannot part the discussion from who is actually paying, because that's the difference how you see it. Is it the individual paying for it with all his loans on his further careers, or is it the society who invests in certain things? But in the end, somebody is paying for that, and of course we need to be honest with the money we get from the person who pays from the institution who pays for that. So we need to think about how to make a system out of that.
One of the things that always fascinates me is I'm very interested when the world proves me wrong. I would have been of the opinion that if the individual is paying for something, that will put pressure on the providers to become more efficient and reduce the cost. Yet Ulf refers to the contrast between the US and Europe, where it's heavily subsidized in Europe. What would you say? The consumer has to pay for it in the US, and yet they have a bigger problem with the cost of higher education than we do over here. I would have put it, and this was to discuss barriers to cost reduction. To some extent, I think we're broadening out into the idea about should we be reducing the cost. But it would have been my assumption that if the consumer is paying, that will push down prices. And the fact that higher education is so subsidized in Europe, that removes the pressure to reduce the cost of provision. But I seem to have been disproved on that. I would like now to, there's comments there, so if people, if you remember the link to get in, maybe you can vote in those comments, but I'd like people maybe to put up their hand and maybe expand on some of the things that you said there. Maybe actually, before you do, would the position being taken here that maybe we shouldn't be reducing expenditure on higher education, but we should be looking for efficiencies to spend the money more wisely. Anyone care to comment on that? I'm not sure I'm in agreement with that myself, by the way.
Maybe I can try.
No.
This is not a really big audience, but it's not a problem. So I put up like cultural rigidity. And I put it up and I listened to your story. I thought, all right, this is exactly what I mean. Also in terms of what you say. So for example, if you, well, it's my idea that if you would like to go from A to B and you could buy a car, then what do people think about buying cars? You would say, well, then if it's like a personal thing that you buy the cheapest car that you can get, and the smallest one, because it gets you from A to B. But that's of course not the case. There's also people who say, I want to have a Maserati, like our keynote speaker says, because there's other things that also determine cost. And maybe in higher education, Ivy League kind of institutions, because they're very expensive, people think they're very good. So there's actually no limitation on getting the cost higher, because it's a sign of quality. And I would call it a cultural rigidity in terms of how people watch upon it. If we would talk in the Netherlands about reducing cost of our education, directly the whole discussion about quality would step up, and it would be like a boomerang that comes back. So there is, in our universities, it's very difficult to talk about reducing cost, because in a political sense, you directly feel that, okay, if we reduce cost, we will be looked upon earlier in comparison to our competitors, like there were, that we would be a poorer institution. It would be a very damaging thing for us. So I think cultural rigidity, as you tell it from the different perspectives, is a very big barrier to really reducing cost. Following a MOOC is not actual education in terms of the view of many people, though it might be very good. Just reading a book is also a very good education. It simply costs you $50 and you can get very knowledgeable in any kind of subject you like, but it's not viewed upon as high quality education. So that was the point that I would like to make with the top left one, the cultural rigidity one.
I've added there, and Brian Kaplan from the US was here 2 years ago, and he talked about the signaling effect. And when you talk about culture, culture is quite a broad, cultural rigidity is quite a broad thing. The signaling part of it is a sort of subsection of culture. And that's, I think any economists here, is it Veblen goods or something like that? These are goods that are valued even more once they become harder to get, which is almost it almost seems like a contradiction, but I would put that down as signaling. And signaling, the whole signaling effect may be one of the most powerful barriers to us reducing costs.
Can I add something? Or there's some more.
Well, I just want to show you my perspective, because I'm rector of private university in Poland with more than 27,000 students, so it's quite a big. And we are struggling every day to reduce costs, to optimize business processes. And I came here to this panel because I thought that I will find some new solutions, for example, for our problem of high share of teachers' remuneration in cost structure. Why? Because we are not subsidized, and we optimize businesses mainly because we want to have better quality and better accessibility. So this is our reason why we reduce costs, optimize. I don't like the word reducing costs. Optimizing is a better word, in my opinion. So reducing costs is our paradigm, or optimizing costs is our paradigm in order to give better quality for good price. And this is mass higher education, of course. But our students pay usually around 1,500 euros per year. So this is the effect of those optimizations. Is quality high? Well, not my, it's in my opinion, yes. But we want money to invest in the technologies we see here on the corridors. We need that money. We will not get subsidies from the government, so we have to reduce.
So is it fair to say that if your students are paying 1,500 euro per year, that your cost of provision is around that if you're getting no subsidies, that your current cost of provision?
We use, of course, EU funds, of course. This is kind of subsidy, but they pay, it is because of this cost reduction. For example, now we think, how can we sustain good quality of classes with a higher number of participants? Because we want to pay teachers more. We want to have best teachers, but we cannot afford it if they faced with 20 or 30 students. So we look for solutions that will engage students, give them good quality in big groups.
And what would you say are the barriers that you face in trying to reduce costs? Is it resistance from the teachers? Is it perception of the students who might come to your college? Is it lack of technical skills in your staff? What do you see as the barriers?
It's change management, I think. I mean, implementing solutions and barriers related to change management problems.
And would that be a bigger issue? When I hear people talk about change management, they include it in the whole culture thing, that say that this is the way our staff think about education. We have to get them to think differently. Is this the change management? Yeah.
Partly, yes. Yes.
Yeah. Can I ask another question? Go ahead, Ulrike.
And I would like to respond actually to both of you, because I think what you suggest, the change we are facing, whether we reduce costs or we differently allocate costs, is enormous. That's the transition to really integrate digital possibilities in every aspect of our institutions, in administration, in teaching, in whatsoever, in opening up for other target groups, in lifelong learning, everywhere it is. The biggest enemy, and I agree with you, there are two faults. It's the old-fashionedness of our, we still are in bricks, we think in bricks, our administration is in bricks, teachers teach the old way, you need a lecture hall, we are very much, we sit in a culture from where we have all the same idea about how education should be, and that's classrooms and things and people who go there. And the other thing, I agree with you, there's another threat if there is state funding, that the students see it as a commodity. And actually they think, and that was my discussion on study loan or not, they think it's their personal right even to have money for go there, and then they need money to go out and drink beer. I mean, they should drink as much beer as they can, but I'm not sure that we should actually subsidize that. We should subsidize the education. So these are the barriers of the really having the transition, and the barriers are there, whether you reduce costs or you do it differently, they are there anyhow. So we discussed the barriers actually of a transition to a more efficient education system where we really embrace all forms from scalable education, anonymous education, MOOCs, whatever, until the small-scale meetings in a university.
This seems to be another issue of culture coming up here, and this might be student expectations. Higher education has always been a certain way. When students sign up after they finish secondary school to go to higher education, they expect it a certain way, and they're the ones that don't necessarily want to change. So that culture is even backing into the students, not just our staff, but into the students coming in. This worries me because as an engineer, culture is a mystery to me. And I have and I said to them, well, maybe we should talk about solutions as well. And I haven't a lot to contribute to that, I have to say. But I mean, I do constantly come up with the barriers. Sorry, Ulf, you were going to say.
Yeah, I wanted to say that now when we use this term costs, and you're using it in a way, and you're using it in a way, and I'm using it in a way, and we all have, so to speak, our own experience in our background, and you're maybe asking yourselves a question, or the audience asking, 1,500 euros, is that actually high or low? So, and that's exactly the point, because education has no price, so to speak. It has no defined, so to speak, return. Yeah. So with the best education, you can decide to go to do pro bono work and not earn a lot. But you also can decide to earn a lot and to have a big return. So, there is no, so to speak, guaranteed return except for the public sector in Germany. For example, when you become a teacher, then you have a more or less guaranteed good middle income. So that's a guaranteed return on your education, on your higher education. And so as a state, you can start to calculate them. You can start to calculate and say, okay, this is what we pay them, and how much do they cost when we educate them, and is that a good relation in a way? But then it becomes tricky, because what's the impact of a teacher? So I'm making this game, and I think you're all familiar with this. You can, so to speak, start to ask questions on these issues. I'm actually, I was, for 6 years, I was the first vice president of a new university in my state, in Germany. We have 16 states, and in the south of Germany, in the state where I live, the government decided to merge 8 academies into one new university, and they asked me to be part of this first presidential team as a vice president. And so we had to set up the entire structure, so to speak. Yeah, and because we were a merger, we were not a startup but a merger. We were immediately super big. We're immediately the biggest university in the state. We have 52 universities, and we were the biggest in this state. We have 52 universities, and we were the biggest one. And so always when we had a meeting with the Ministry of Higher Education, every 2-3 years, when it came down to finances, we were the enemy of everybody else, because we had 10% of the share of students, and we also wanted to have 10% of the budget. But we were new, and so it was quite a difficult situation for everybody there. And so I know exactly what a good costing argument is. If I, for example, say, listen, if you give me, we cost 200 million euros per year. That's what the government pays for my university per year. If I, for example, argue, since we are a dual university, where the students are studying in our university, it's a state university, state-funded university, but they are also, every 3 months, alternating into the practice organizations. In a dual university, you do that. And they receive a trainee salary of this practice organizations. Yeah. So, and so I was always saying, you know, you as a government, you are paying 200 million euros, but we have 35,000 students, and the cost for the students, for the practice partners, is every year roughly 30,000 euros in training salaries for each one of the students. If you calculate that, you can say the government is paying 200 million, but the private sector is paying in this trainee salaries over 1 billion euros. So 200 million is not much, you know, to educate the students when society participates with like 5 times that number. And after 3 years, you have good employees and so on. So I know exactly how that is. But from the story already, you see that costs and benefits and returns are nothing which you can, so to speak, naturally calculate, but they are always a matter of a subscribed value. And that's the political debate, the societal agreement we need about that. Mm-hmm. Do we want this? Do we want that? And so on. And for me, I can clearly say, I've worked in over 22 African countries also, and over 11 Latin American countries, and created higher education partnerships there and so on. And I can say from that perspective also that the value of a good education cannot be valued high enough. from everywhere I look in the world, actually, I can say that. And also in the US, I think at least when Obama came, that was already like decades ago, he was having in one of his first programs concerning education, he had a policy on creating an entire college degree curriculum open access. So for several disciplines, he had this plan. I think that was not really always implemented in a good way, but he had this plan to publish the materials which a student would need in order to receive a college degree completely as open educational resources. And that shows something, that it's not unquestioned in the US if a paid tuition paid system is without alternatives. Let's put it like that.
If I may add or something, I think the costs, the hard costs, we can calculate, and that might be your problem, that maybe 1,500 euro are not enough to actually sustain the system you want. The outcomes, you cannot optimize a pedagogy system, what you said. If we go there and we expect everybody to have a job and to be that and to be that, there we should be careful actually to really make that very hard, because what about humanities? What about other studies? What about all the problems we have in the world which are transdisciplinary? So if we go too straight down from what you need and from A to B, and you step in the Maserati or whatever and you go there, I am not sure it will the world make better in the end. So there should always be a manifold of learning paths, of open learning paths, closed learning paths, whatever, that really people can develop, and we might see what the outcome is. And
just before that, would it be fair to say maybe that because we can't quantify the benefits of higher education, the whole funding of higher education, particularly in Europe, becomes a political issue? What can the politicians that we have, the higher education institutions clamoring for money, the politicians they've got to take the tax money and divide it up between various things, and they pull figures out of the air. What are they doing in the country next to us? What are they doing that? That this idea that maybe 2% of GDP is reasonable to spend on higher education is just picked out of the air. There's no quantitative justification for it. And even the fact that people aren't even sure if there's causation relations between the amount spent on higher education and the economic activity in a country. Some people say that it's the economic activity that causes the expenditure on higher education, not the other way around. So the very fact that we can't quantify the benefits makes it very hard for us to decide how much to spend on higher education and to push people to reduce the costs. I mean, I would almost think, and I've changed my mind previously, that the fact that Europe subsidizes higher education, that forces them to put a cap on it, and maybe that's why the cost of provision in Europe is lower than before. But that would suggest that a solution to reducing costs in education is reduce subsidy further. The institutions will respond. So I think you were first up here. I'll get you next.
I like your Lumen example earlier, you know, that because we're dealing with people, we cannot just optimize it, you know, like a factory floor. And it makes me think of a simple example from my local primary. It makes me think of a simple example from my local primary school, actually. You know, in my spare time, I'm the chairman of the board at the primary school. And they took a chance and they started out with 3 classes in the, you know, in the first grade of the school, even though the council only actually gave them funding for 2 because they were quite small. It was a small year, right? But it was a growing area, so they thought, we'll take a chance, you know, more kids will come. 2 years later, the kids haven't come, so we still have 3 classes, only getting funding for 2 basically, so losing 100,000 euros a year, right? So the rational thing to do would be let's put them in 2 big classes, 28 kids in each class, we'll save money. But because it's human beings, you know, we have teachers who we would change their world, we would change the world of 50, 60 families. So we've decided to still not do it. We're still waiting for those few extra kids to come so we can get the extra funding. Is it worth it? I don't know, but you know, and we'll have the same situation in higher education, you know. There's so many, you know, possibilities for optimization, but we're dealing with humans, so we can't just say, hey, that course you did last year, could you do that online? And we'll just do it for 500 students instead of 30, you know. We're dealing with humans, so it's a tough job.
Thank you. There's another question here.
Yes, you both told us that you have public funding at your universities. Does that also mean that since the government more or less is funding it, that also they put on restrictions on your intake of students? For instance, that they compare the number of students starting on an educational program with the employability of the graduates for that program. And if the employability is low, then they will also lower the intake that they will fund.
No. We are autonomous. They would like to control it a little bit, but in the end, very often the institutions themselves have a numerus fixus or certain things, but steering people into certain areas until now is only done by communication and other things, not by a general fixed thing from the government.
Okay. Do you think then that one way of lowering the cost of higher education could be that you lower the intake on the specific programs that have a low employability and thereby reducing the cost without reducing the quality of the actual educational programs?
Yeah, the difficulty is, what does the government and the politicians at that moment believe is worth the investment for the future? That's a tricky thing, and I think in the academic freedom it's especially emphasized that you should have all disciplines that you could develop in humanities, and not only in beta and data, and in the end we have only data specialists and the world is very poor, you know. It's a dilemma, and I would have different ideas, and especially for the Netherlands, and I understand you're Dutch as well, you're a colleague from... look, I think, for instance, in a small region where we are, we should open up towards each other much more. Like, I know you are a big fan of the Khan Academy, from certain things. We should have Khan Academies for biology, chemistry, English, whatever. All this stuff which makes the threshold knowledge, we could train the people far more efficient. On the bigger side, or on the systemic side, if we open up our study guides towards each other, students can far more easily take a course on a different institution. Beside the fact that Holland is very small and travel is easy, in case you didn't know, even by having online or hybrid or blended education, this will be really far more facilitated. So you might get more a system where we will be competitors, but as well we could work together, collaborators. Like Wageningen University has specialized things where all the students come in the masters. Another one, where are you from? Which? VU. They certainly will go to the VU for certain humanities or medicine or other things. So in this way we could use our specialities far more. Students could have far more diversity in how they move through the system. You could have more different ways of educating that, and that would probably make the whole system more efficient. But we need to invest in the administrative technology behind that, because now we are not there anywhere near.
Can I just pick up on that, because I do want to move the discussion on a little bit to And this is, when you mentioned the Khan Academy, this is an EdTech conference. Most people coming here would have some confidence that the use of technology can make things better and maybe make things cheaper. We've seen MOOCs emerging maybe at postgraduate, the Georgia Tech Masters in Computer Science, which they're able to do as Americans, unlike Minerva, by the way, that I don't see as a great progress at all. But the Georgia Tech Computer Science Masters is $7,000, which is dirt cheap in the US. Arizona State University have developed an adaptive degree in, I think it's biology, okay, where the students are basically doing what you've just mentioned, Ulrike, which is they're going through these threshold concepts, the simple scientific principles that you would do in first year college, maybe second year in college. And there seems to be great potential there, both to use technology to both improve quality, because they're using a competency-based approach. In other words, you're going through this and you have to reach certain levels of competency before you move on to each thing. That is theoretically cheaper as well as better. Why are more people not doing this? What is the barrier that more universities are not copying Arizona? Now, you may not agree that what they're doing is a good thing. I personally think it's a great thing. Is it because we're subsidized? We have no incentive.
Maybe because they are subsidized.
And we've no incentive to improve.
Sure, we do have. And we have automated everything that could be automated.
Well, I was going to say the other way around, and the point about investment is true as well. To say, okay, well, we'd like to do what Arizona State do. Do you do what Arizona State does? You're not as... Partly. Okay, so this is the type of insight. Now, can I get any other reactions on that? In other words, what I'm saying is, if some people seem to have managed to get technology to reduce costs and improve quality, why aren't we copying that? Maybe you have some other thing you want to talk about.
So I'm from the United States, so this is a very interesting conversation. I think it would be very different if it was in the United States than here. And so, and yeah, and I also primarily work on MOOCs, so this is all very relevant. And I think right now we're at a time in the US where people are starting to see the shift where more people are aware of the inflated cost and not having value on the return. And I think before this, students were really uninformed. They were not informed on what is the value of this. Like, I'm just going to do this because my parents did it, and I'm going to go to the school and I'm going to pay this money. And, you know, people did not understand going to this school at $30,000 is very different from going to this other school at $30,000, you know, that nobody has ever heard of, and you wouldn't get recognized to get a job after. And there's been studies like of schools where students graduate with a computer science degree and then they have to go do retraining, like they're not qualified for any jobs after. And so I think students just are really unaware of that when they sign up and go to a school, and they're just paying that. And then, but now the pressures, like the enrollments are increasing at these places that are offering like at scale, cheaper options. And the pressure will be on because now that everyone has tried online courses, that they'll understand, okay, this is more flexible, this is more affordable. And we've been doing a lot of online courses at MIT, but none of those count for credit. And so, you know, having that more schools accept online courses for credit, because so many have seen it as, well, this is just for fun, but this is not, you know, we can't trust this enough to be for credit. And so I think if that shifts more, and there's this competition, and the MIT has kept the same with the number of students. We're not having increased costs because of increased students, but there's competition between schools for enrollments at the majority of other schools where they're just trying to get more and more students. So to compete for those students, they have to do these other costs like build fancier buildings, have better dorms, have better gyms that have nothing to do really with the teaching, but it's like just to attract students to their campus. But if more students want to be remote, then they don't need to necessarily do those things. And I think there will be just schools that lose out. soon that are going to have to shut down, and that will happen more and more because they're not going to be able to keep up with enrollments.
Do you think that this will lead to reduction in costs and fees in the US? Like,
Yeah.
I mentioned this where I've been proved wrong, that I thought that the consumer paying would push down costs, when in the US it was almost the
Yeah.
opposite, because the colleges do so much to spend so much money acquiring students, whereas the publicly funded seems to work better. The comment over here about subsidy would lead me maybe to go back to my assertion, and I'm sure there'll be plenty who wouldn't agree, that the way to get a university to reduce costs is to just pressure down that subsidy, and they'll think of a way, because governments have no idea how to do it. So they will just give them less money.
May I not agree with that?
I'll think about that. Okay, go ahead.
Now, the way would be that we make it more personal sort of rights for the student. If we subsidize, we shouldn't subsidize totally the institutions, but we should do it via the students. The students have certain rights. They get a portfolio, a wallet, where what they can spend on education. It would make them actually aware that you have to spend something on education, that it's not just a commodity. And then you could even expand it for lifelong learning. Then they could actually set it for the path they would like to go, interrupt it or go later or whatsoever. That would make us a little bit more aware, where are we good in? What is actually our asset? What should we leave to others? How should we collaborate on basic education and all these kind of things? I think that would probably be a way of making the cash flow more clear, but not putting it down, not reducing the costs to an already quite stressed system, what we have, and not putting it on the shoulders of students alone.
Yeah, that's fine. You can disagree. You haven't persuaded me. One of the things I did want to ask, and there's two of them here, fear of loss of quality and fear of loss of reputation. Now, to some extent, I am of the opinion that if you can do a certain job at 20% of the cost and get 80% of your previous quality, that if you can get significant cost reductions, even at a loss of quality, that is very good value for money. Is that concept anathema in higher education? Is that just too shocking to bear? I'm sure you think it is, Ulrike.
Well, the secret to answer this question lies in what is value.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I mean, as a principle, that just say we could significantly reduce our costs and only slightly bring down our quality, could we tolerate? Now, let me give an example. I think we all know online education can be as good as campus education, but just say we had a sort of form of self-paced online education, a bit like MOOCs. It can be a fraction of the cost, but lots of people will say that is not the same quality as people sitting in classrooms. And we'll say, and particularly at postgraduate level, at master's degree level, we'll say, yeah, well, it mightn't be quite as good, but it costs the state a lot less, it costs people a lot less. So maybe this is a better way to go. So my question in terms of barriers is our lack of tolerance for any reduction in quality a barrier to reducing costs?
Well, I'm not sure about this. I think for me, I must say the big issue is not the cost issue, but the big issue is the question: can we flexibilize education offerings? You can again connect it to costs, probably.
Yeah, you're getting to an iron square now. You've got
Well,
flexibility.
no, you can say flexibilize probably has to do with access and with quality as well. But In my view and in my studies and in our publications, I'm heading a research group on next education. That's how we call it, future higher education. And we are constantly publishing about this issue, how in 10 years and 20 years higher education will look like. And it will look like a multi-institutional pathway, for example. That's one of the scenarios which we are designing. That means student 1 is not graduating from the university where he started to study, but he's maybe graduating from a different university. And until graduation, he's or she's studying in a, so to speak, multi-institutional setting. One course in this university, another course in this university, and so on. And of course, the question depends, which course will they choose? What is attractiveness there? Yeah, is it cost? Or is it, alternative costs like distance or so, or attractiveness of the tutor? I don't know what kind of motivating factors and hindering factors are there. The second issue, which we think is for the future will also be an important scenario, is that we have to move away from packaging higher education, pre-packaging higher education, into a, so to speak, a product portfolio, if I may use this term, although I'm not the so to speak, the fully convinced person of using this term, but if it's a good term, but it's not, the future of higher education is not lying in the disciplines which we have now, because the problems we have to solve in society are not oriented towards disciplines in our science system. And so we think that the future in 10, 20 years will look like a future in which students are first developing their curriculum and selecting and choosing their courses. And in the first phase, this will be a phase in which they are designing their study paths, so to speak, coached also and validated, but they will, so to speak, do that on behalf of themselves. And that only these two out of 4 scenarios which we are currently designing, only these 2 do not sound as if higher education will probably be, so to speak, if costs are the big issue there. But the big issue probably will be, is higher education still relevant to the life challenges which people are facing, actually, when they want to study throughout their life, and not just, for economic reason, also in a society in which we have a high potential of automation through digital technology, in a society where work will play a different role, not be the super defining, so to speak, factor of life, but where also our spare time and our other things which we are doing are going to become very important. So meaning and sense making and so on will.
Well, I mean, to me, it sounds like that you're answering my question is that no, we're not. That there's so much improvement to be made to higher education right now, and we've got such a range of ideas on how to improve it. That's what we should be concentrating on, and we shouldn't tolerate a reduction in quality. Yeah. I'm just going to, we'll move to wrapping it up now, but Ulrike, you might make a last contribution, and then anyone who wants to contribute and stay on as long as you like, will do that, and anyone who wants to leave. So go ahead, Ulrike.
Now, I pretty much have the same opinion as Ulf, and what he just sketched was what I call the Lonely Planet Study Guide, with traveler guides along, and maybe even lifelong learning, and we are already starting to actually make that happen. And I really strongly, look, Brian, I think we can reduce costs in certain aspects. I fully agree. But in the end, and I recognize your problem being a member of edX as well, I know exactly what's going on over there. But in the end, I think academic training is more than just following online courses and exactly facing the world's problem, which are huge. I mean, all the, which are transdisciplinary, which ask for critical-minded people. I mean, look what's happening around us. We shouldn't underestimate what we should do in the academic network and in the academic society. And hopefully, our public values in the European system will still stand up against that, or hold strong and defend that, and not just making it a commodity and something where you, where price is the only thing which matters.
Now it looks like, and in terms of the panel, I've lost the debate here. I'm not sure how you're feeling in the audience. I mean, I do believe that we need to reduce costs, and so I'll tell you, we'll take a few comments now and questions before. Actually, I'd prefer if they weren't questions, because I think there's probably a number of you who want to comment, and we might get into too long a debate. So, but if you have questions, if you feel you have a necessary question.
Perhaps a comment, at least. I was thrilled by the question, reducing cost in higher education. And I came because my big question was, why? For what purpose? For what purpose?
These are your people.
And yeah, and I know, but as a senior manager, as a director, the costs always, they never extend the fundings. Deficit is not an option, where I come from. But the question I always ask, how to use the funds wisely. And there we need more knowledge. And that's, in my opinion, the main problem. How to get the most success or the best outcome of the funding. And there's a great lack of knowledge.
And you seem to be in agreement with the two here that I mean, we said earlier on, I think we more or less agreed that we don't seem to have a formula that allows us to calculate what percentage of GDP should be spent on higher education. But let's not reduce it, and let's make the best use of it we can by finding efficiencies in some areas and using them to improve the service in other areas.
For me, it is quite obvious that we want to reduce some costs in order to have funds to invest in those solutions that give the best value to our clients. So that's the idea of reducing costs in order to better serve the clients. But I have one remark. Your question about good enough was based on an assumption that online courses, e-learning, blended learning and so on is not so efficient as face-to-face learning.
Not as effective or not as efficient? No, not as good or?
I think that it can be at least as good,
okay.
Because when we provide them with knowledge, we can concentrate during face-to-face contact on developing those skills we want to develop, critical thinking and so on.
Agreed.
So reducing costs in that areas that are not so strictly connected with added value to the client is it is a necessity.
Like the administrative.
And when you are
subsidized,
subsidized, you do not have that much incentive to do that.
Yeah, I think also the OECD is prognosticating, how do you say, is forecasting a ratio of academic education of young people in the amount of about 70% by 2045. 70%. In Germany, we have now 53%. So even in a declining demographic situation in which we are in Germany a little bit, that means that we will have much more people in our universities than now in the future, much more. And not just much more, but also very different target groups, not the young, talented science person, but people from all walks of life, you know, and in all ages coming back also into higher education. And for that, we have a challenge, which I believe very much. We can only, like you say, and that's why I came to this idea now, which we only can solve through digital technology, through flexibilization and individualization of tuition, courses, and so on. And of course, hopefully of good, of good digital supported technology. Yeah.
A question down there or a comment?
Actually, another question. Hello, my name is André Dietrich from the University of Freiberg, and one way of, like I see, of reducing cost is probably just like every university, every teacher is like producing its, not a probably teacher, but professor, his content by his own. It's like most universities have their Moodle, and they're like we in Saxony use Opal, for example. And the biggest problem is that these are repetitive steps, so everyone is doing this again and again and again. And even if Moodle is open source, these are isolated islands in this case. And probably we could reduce costs if we this educational content, or the process of creating educational content could be something like a community effort. I mean, where students could contribute, change probably the type of the online course, because I mean, we are talking about technology and there's learning analytics, but there's nothing like teaching analytics. Probably the course that the professor has created is crap, you know, just like, and it had to restructure it or somehow taught completely different. But this is somehow missing, I mean, if we're talking about technology.
But I fully agree, and if you walk around there are many already initiatives, and as well in, I don't know about Germany, but in Netherlands, we start to have huge platforms to share and whatsoever. Still it is that initially you have to actually to invest, to make it really work and to have good quality things and good quality whatever materials for statistics, biology, chemistry, name it. But I fully agree, I'm fully on your side. And then you could think from the time it's left, what do you do with this? How do you train the students? How do you open up for lifelong learning? Because it's not anymore that I'm finished after 5 years and then never come back.
Hello, I'm Barbara, I'm from Poland. I'd like to say about two things. First of all, about the flexibility. We talked about the flexibility of services for students. I think that they also bear a huge cost. We are now in the midst of thinking about our strategy for the online courses in our schools, and we're counting it, and it will have to cost a lot first in order for it to work. So that's one point I wanted to make. And the other thing is about the students' maturity, I think, because we talk about lifelong learning, giving students the opportunity to choose. In Poland, I believe too much flexibility could be a problem, because there's still this mindset that the diploma of the school is the actual value. We talked about what is the value, and not actually the quality of services. And the third point I wanted to make is that when we were talking to our teachers, our faculty, about creating MOOCs, creating online courses, there is a big, in Poland still, there's a big, and I would say it's a barrier still, of the knowledge I have is mine. I don't want to give it out. I will lose something if I give it out. So that's still something that we have to work on with our faculty. It's still there, and it is a big barrier. Thank you.
It looks like I don't even have anyone in the audience that's on my side. The general feeling, oh yeah, good stuff. The general feeling seems to be that, of course, we need efficiencies, but really the objective is so we can move resources to where we can do better. I think we'll wrap it up there. This did not work out as I planned. I don't mean really even in terms of me persuading people that we need to reduce costs. And I mean, I said barriers and solutions and things like that. And we have identified some barriers to change, more than as much as the barriers to cost reduction. But it is, as they say, a wicked problem. You know, there are so many variables involved, so many interest groups that it's very difficult. So if this session just got us to think maybe in a slightly different way, I hope maybe it was somewhat successful. And thanks for coming. Thank you.